Hello and welcome back. This is the week 8 lecture. So I realize that many of us are probably still finishing Edgar Huntley this week, and that's okay. I kind of designed this week to be a little bit on the light side, just because I was anticipating a little bit of a slow progression through Huntley, particularly even more so because we kind of let the Coquette spill over into one of our originally scheduled Huntley weeks, and that was my fault. So a lot of us might not have really gotten started on Huntley until last week. So it's no big deal if you are still finishing it up, but try to get it finished soon at some point this week so you can move on to our two major authors for week 8, Washington Irving and Nathaniel Hawthorne. I forgot to include Irving on my syllabus originally, and that's just an oversight, kind of an inexcusable one, frankly, because Irving plays a very important role in early American literary history. So we have to spend a little bit of time with him. We're really not going to do him justice because he is a very important figure for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons I don't spend a ton of time on him in my classes is frankly because he doesn't write a ton of fiction. He's probably a little bit better known for some of his travelogues. He wrote history, he wrote biographies. Much like Brown, he was kind of more of an all-purpose man of letters rather than somebody we would identify as a novelist or, a full-time fiction writer. I do think Irving's important as an early practitioner of the short story. We're going to be looking at Poe pretty soon, and Poe, along with Hawthorne, really are often given a lot of credit for developing the short story in the U.S. But before them, Irving was already producing short fiction that was quite popular, quite good, and it sort of set some templates or standards for those later authors to follow. So I want to start with Irving today, and then we're going to talk a little bit about Nathaniel Hawthorne as well. Actually, more than just a little bit, but we're only going to cover one of Hawthorne's stories. I posted 3 to the week 8 module, but I really only want to talk about my kinsman, Major Molyneux. That's just one of my personal favorites. I have a lot to say about it, and it really demonstrates a lot of Hawthorne's preoccupations, a lot of his most common themes and motifs. So by studying that story, we can understand more about the author in general. And those other 2 stories by him, Young Goodman Brown and Roger Malvin's Burial, those are essentially optional this week. Again, I want to kind of keep the reading load light. So if you can only get to one of Hawthorne's stories, make it My Kinsman. That's the best one, I think. It's the most fun, it's the most interesting, and it's the one that I'm going to be talking about today, and it's going to be the one that will eventually show up on the final exam. As for Irving, I posted 2 stories by him. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which most of us are probably familiar with, even if we haven't read it. It's one of those texts that's still kind of embedded in our popular culture. So you've at least heard of it. Maybe you saw the movie version that came out like 20 years ago with Johnny Depp. So we will talk about that. And I also posted Dolph Haliger, a very sort of weird, complex short story. It's a longer short story, roughly 50 pages. But it's really cool, and it's kind of funny and interesting, and Irving's doing a lot of the same work in that text that he's doing in Sleepy Hollow. So here's the deal with Irving for this week. I know some of you have already read The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So if you're already familiar with that text, if you've read it for a previous class, or if you just read it for pleasure years ago, I would like you to read Dolph instead. Tackle the other text so you can experience a little bit more of Irving, something different from Irving. But if you've never read Irving before, if you haven't experienced either text, then just take your pick. They're both pretty lengthy, so I'm not going to demand that everybody read both. So if you've never read anything really by Washington Irving, take your pick. But if you've already read Sleepy Hollow, tackle Dolph Hailiger instead. So those are those are the texts I want to start with. Let's just get into Irving a little bit as a figure, as a historical figure. So we're sort of picking up roughly where we left off with Brown. Brown sort of took us into the 19th century. Edgar Huntley was published at the very end of the 18th century, and Brown continued to write novels up until about 1801, and then he just abruptly stopped writing fiction, as I mentioned. But now we are in the 19th century. Things are modernizing a little bit, and the American literary scene is continuing to develop. So if we jump ahead a couple of decades, we find Washington Irving emerging as a really important figure in this early American literary scene. So we mentioned Brown as sort of America's first real man of letters, or some would argue he was really America's first professional writer. Because he did make his living both publishing fiction, but also not only publishing fiction, but also publishing book reviews. He was an editor. He ran various magazines, literary journals. So not only was he writing his own work, he was reviewing the work of others. He was putting together publications that would help to, sort of bring American literature to the people. He wasn't immensely popular, though, is the thing you have to remember. I mean, some people obviously knew who he was. He was well known in Philadelphia, where he lived pretty much his entire life. But he wasn't exactly a celebrity, and he wasn't read overseas. He might have gained some recognition within the U.S., but even during his peak productivity, those years at the very end of the 1700s and the very beginning of the 1800s, most American readers were still primarily consuming European texts. The American literary scene was still not very well developed. Sure, there had been some popular books already published, as we've seen. We talked about Charlotte Temple. The Coquette was pretty popular. The Power of Sympathy, that first novel ever published in the U.S. back in 1789, that was fairly popular. They all sold pretty well. People, readers certainly were buying those titles, but there was not really a famous American author until Irving came along. That's typically how we've understood this progression. We can see Irving as kind of our first literary celebrity. Again, he didn't write a ton of fiction, but what he did was he helped to export American writings abroad. He became somewhat popular in Europe. The French read him. The English read him. He also was a diplomat, and he lived a good portion of his life in Europe. He lived in England for a while. He lived in Spain for a while. So he was pretty worldly. He traveled, and he was read and reviewed and appreciated overseas. And we're pretty sure he's the first American author that we can really say that about. So that's important just from a historical standpoint. Irving helps to make it possible for other American writers to kind of have a reach and to maybe garner a reputation. If you guys look in the modules, I haven't really mentioned this quote, but I have a little quote for each of our major units of the semester, and we're currently in Unit 2. And the quote that I have for Unit 2 is from a British book reviewer, critic, writer in the 1820s named Sidney Smith. And he asks, rhetorically, I guess, who in the four corners of the globe reads an American book. And I put that in there just to kind of give you guys a sense of what a lot of the perception was about early U.S. literature. We didn't really have a place at the table when it came to English literary traditions or the literary traditions in continental Europe, which were, of course, much older. So at the end of the 18th century, at the beginning of the 19th century, a lot of Europeans didn't really think that we even had a literary culture. Now, you might not really care what they think, but just, in terms of the broader perception, and it was kind of reinforced even here with our own citizens. Like I said, a lot of U.S. readers at that time would have preferred books from England or France or, other places because we didn't have a whole lot of fictional production. We didn't have a whole lot coming out here. We had some, but, we just weren't at that stage in our history as an early nation. Many historians will point out that literary production, creating art, wasn't always a top priority for sort of early Americans. And I think we can understand many of the reasons why. We were engaged in a lot of other endeavors, just that constant push westward, clearing forests, Native American wars, building new towns, new cities, establishing civic institutions. So the kind of the narrative that we've heard for a long time, the way we've explained this for a long time, is that Americans were maybe a little more focused on building, farming, sort of carving out an existence in this still very new place. Again, new to Europeans, at least, or to people of European descent. So in the midst of all of those other priorities, maybe writing, creating fiction wasn't really high on the list. And there's some truth to that. I think we kind of oversimplify a little bit if we buy too much into that, but there's definitely some truth to it. And as the middle class begins to develop, as more parts of the U.S. become settled, we do see more writing. We do see a growth in the literary scene. So we'll track that change as we continue to move throughout the 19th century. But again, just remember Irving as an important figure in that development, as he helped to sort of take us, helped to kind of make this transition from the very, very early days of fiction in the U.S. to something that we can maybe begin to recognize a little more. We begin to kind of come into our own as we move up into the 1820s and the 1830s. So just a few things about Irving that I wanted to talk about. So he's an interesting guy. Some people, again, Brown sometimes gets this title, but I think Irving gets it a little bit more as the grandfather of American literature. I think we should be careful with that title, though, because we've already seen the important role that a lot of women writers played back in the 1790s. Susanna Rowson, Hannah Webster Foster. Going back even further, we can think about Phyllis Wheatley. We can think about Anne Bradstreet. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous to act like Brown and Irving were inventing American literature. I wouldn't go that far, but at least in part due to the misogyny of the time, you could probably make the case that they were helping to popularize American literature. And like I said, that's really where Irving comes in. So he was born in New York City in the late 18th century. And what we're going to notice with both of Irving's texts is that he's very interested in historicizing the U.S., much like some of these other older writers that we've talked about, such as Philip Freneau, and to some extent maybe Brown as well. They're very interested in sort of finding a unique history and mythology in the U.S., something that's unique to us. Things that we have that maybe the older cultures in Europe don't have. And in the case of Freneau and Brown, like we've talked about, their search led them to the forest, led them to the environment, the unique geography of the U.S., which, you guys know, our geography is quite different than the geography that you'll find in most European countries. So that's where they found a lot of U.S. novelty, U.S. distinctiveness. And in the case of Freneau, and I think Brown too, they were very aware that American history, if we're thinking about old history, ancient history, American mythology too, largely comes from Native Americans. Freneau was kind of keen on that and interested in that. I think Brown was just more scared of Native Americans by and large, and scared of what happens to white people when they go out in the forest and sort of live near Native Americans or live like Native Americans, like we were talking about last week. But we see Irving engaged in a similar task, but he has a different focus. So Irving is not terribly interested in Native Americans, but he is interested in an older phase of American history. But for Irving, that older period of American history is Dutch history. It's Dutch colonial history as it played out in New York. So a lot of you might know that before New York was New York, it was New Amsterdam. It was originally colonized by the Dutch in the 1620s. So this is just kind of interesting from a historical standpoint because we've already looked at early Puritan writings from the 1600s. So you might want to keep in mind that as the Puritans are colonizing New England, in this early part of the first half of the 1600s, the Dutch are doing the same thing in New York, both the island of Manhattan and also what we would now kind of consider to be parts of upstate New York in and around Albany, and those parts. So that's the history that Irving is tapping into. Not the ancient Native American history that Freneau likes, but the Dutch history of New York. So like I said, Irving himself is from New York City. He does not come from Dutch stock. He is not descendant from the older Dutch settlers, but he's very interested in that history. So the Dutch only reigned supreme in New York for about 40 years. By the 1660s, they were essentially defeated by the English, and the English took over all of their holdings. But as we can tell in Irving's text, a lot of the Dutch colonists stayed. They stayed put. The English did not expel them, did not make them go back to the Netherlands. They were able to stay, and even more Dutch immigrants came even after the English had taken power because there were still these big pockets of Dutch people. So it was a pretty inviting place if you wanted to immigrate, if you wanted to start a new life in the New World. Plenty of Dutch people continued to come over throughout the 1600s and much of throughout the 1700s as well. But eventually they would kind of assimilate into the dominant sort of Anglo culture, Anglo-American culture that was growing up around them that kind of, comes from the English. So by the time, we move up to Irving's adulthood, once we get, well into the 19th century, yeah, there's a lot of people with Dutch last names who still live in New York, but that distinctive Dutch presence was sort of going away. Because again, they were assimilating. If you guys know a little bit about colonial history in the U.S., this plays out a lot. I'm from South Carolina in the Low Country, where there were a lot of French Huguenot settlers in the early days of colonization in that part of the country. And they initially were sort of distinct from the English based on language, if nothing else, and then certain cultural practices. But by around the time of the Revolution, or certainly the early 19th century, those distinctions had kind of melted away. There's still a lot of people in Charleston, in the South Carolina Low Country, who have French last names. But they're not distinctively French, really, in any way, and their families haven't been for, 200 years or 250 years. And that's kind of true of the Dutch in New York. So that change is happening kind of when Irving is writing. So he's very aware of progress and change and how the America that he knew as a boy is not really the America that exists anymore in the sort of 1820s, 1830s. So when Irving's growing up at the end of the 18th century, obviously New York has become pretty thoroughly English. He's born right before the Revolution, so of course he's there for that huge transition into independence, but the Dutch presence is still pretty strong when he's young, when he's a kid. So he kind of grows up hearing these legends, hearing these stories about old Dutch settlers, old Dutch ghost tales, and he's really influenced strongly by that. So when he starts writing, a lot of that stuff makes its way into his text. So he publishes the sketchbook, was one of his first major texts. That came out, I believe, in 1819. And it's kind of a hodgepodge. Like I said, Irving was never really exclusively a fiction writer. So in the sketchbook, there are some short stories, what we would call, short fiction, but there's also nonfiction, like sort of more essay-like pieces, travel logs. He does a lot of different things. He dabbles in a lot of different genres. And you notice even his fiction, it often kind of has a veneer of history. And he creates these personas. He's a very playful writer. I want to just kind of preface my lecture on his text by saying that he's playful and he likes a lot of frame narratives and he likes to sometimes pull the rug out from his readers. So he has these two kind of narrative personas that he creates in his career. In the sketchbook, he creates Geoffrey Crayon. Who, I believe, I'm trying to make sure I get this right. Yeah, Geoffrey Crayon is who we hear from in Dolph Haliger at the beginning of that text. So Crayon is often presented as sort of this urbane, witty narrator who's kind of a stand-in for Irving. He's interested in Dutch history, but the materials that he often works with, or the materials that he's working with in Dolph, actually come from a different narrative persona that Irving created called Diedrich Knickerbocker. And Diedrich Knickerbocker shows up in The History of New York, another early text from Irving. And Knickerbocker is an old Dutch historian. Again, a fictional creation. Irving is just making this person up, but it's supposed to be an old Dutch historian who knows all the lore of Dutch New York. So if you notice in Haliger at the beginning, Heiliger, I think is how you pronounce it. At the beginning of that story, Crayon, we have frames upon frames in Dolph. So at the beginning, Geoffrey Crayon is reading a manuscript written by Diedrich Knickerbocker. And the thing written by Knickerbocker is about this legendary haunted house. So we start with Crayon setting us up, and then we get the bit about the haunted house. Within that manuscript about the haunted house, we then get other stories. So we have these narratives embedded within other narratives. Irving does that a lot. It can get quite complex, but he's also being very playful throughout. So within the manuscript written by Knickerbocker, read by Crayon, we get a couple of stories about the haunted house. First, a story told by Pompey, what we would assume would be a former slave who's now a storyteller, and he sort of regales this audience outside in a graveyard. He tells them a story about the haunted house. But then we get another narrative by this guy, John Jos Vandermeer, which is also about the haunted house, but it's largely about Dolph. So that's where we actually arrive at the main current of action in the text. But even within the story about Dolph, we get another self-contained narrative, this time told by the character Anthony Vanderhayden, who Dolph kind of befriends, and he goes off with this guy and spends time at his estate, which is near it's near Albany, which was again a Dutch outpost, a cluster of Dutch colonial settlement. So then Vanderhayden tells the story about the storm ship, like the ghost ship on the Hudson. So then we get that story embedded within the story about Dolph. And then at the very end, Jeffrey Crayon suggests that he's actually... I'm sorry, I even missed another level. Vanderhayden's story that he tells to Dolph was supposedly written by Mynheer Seln, an early poet of New Amsterdam. So it's not even Vanderhayden's story. He's repeating it. It was originally told by another earlier Dutch source. So it gets very complex. And I think if you're reading the story, you need to figure out what it all means. We're always at such a remove. So much of what's revealed to us as readers comes at a second or third hand remove. And I think we have to ask ourselves, what is the significance of that? What do we make of that? And why is Irving doing that? And then at the end, Crayon suggests that he himself heard this story secondhand from Dolph Heiliger's own lips. But if he heard it secondhand, that would suggest that he's actually hearing it from maybe a friend or an acquaintance of Dolph who heard it directly from Dolph and is now relating it to Crayon. So Crayon claims that he has knowledge of this story that even goes beyond the manuscript by Knickerbocker that he's reading. But even that knowledge that he claims to possess, comes at a second-hand remove. So make what you will of all of that, but just notice how Irving is historicizing old Dutch New York. We learn about these, important landmarks like the Tappan Zee. We see old sort of Albany. We learn about all of these interesting places that are still very much there, obviously, like Dunderberg Mountain. I think it's referred to as Thunder Mountain at some point. That's a place you can go and visit. There's a Dunderberg Mountain. I think it's in this state park called Bear Mountain State Park, I think, and it's just 1 hour north of New York City. So, of course, a lot of these places that are being described in the text are now sort of like bedroom communities or outer suburbs of New York City. But again, they have this interesting and sort of distinctive Dutch history that Irving is playing with. He's taking us back on a journey to this older version of New York that's already sort of distant and almost kind of vanishing by the time Irving is writing. So this is, like 200 years ago, but, this history is almost, there's a sense of loss. There's almost a sense that we're losing some of these old legends, some of these old Dutch ways. And, even though he's often using heavy doses of irony and a lot of misdirection, and we don't really take everything seriously, it does seem like Irving wants to preserve some of this unique culture and history that might be dying away a little bit as we continue to modernize and progress in the 19th century. So, we get these interesting portraits of early Manhattan and other parts of New York, this sort of celebration of a Dutch past, but it's also very comedic, as much of Irving's fiction tends to be, and it's also very much about storytelling. So when you're thinking about all of these different frame narratives and all the different storytellers that we see, look at how many storytellers we see in the text. So I think Irving is making a comment about the nature of storytelling, the nature of narrative, and how it works, how it functions, both for the storytellers and the members of the audience. But as we're going to also see in Sleepy Hollow, he's very interested in change, progress. And progress was really accelerating in the first few decades of the 19th century. You guys need to keep that in mind as important historical context, because Irving is very much aware of it, and some of the other authors that we're going to be reading soon will also comment on it in various ways. So America's changing. America is becoming more industrial. Our population is growing. We're still predominantly an agrarian society, but that is slowly changing in some parts of the country. Uh, you know, and Irving is sort of commenting on progress. He's not always clearly pro-progress because he sees these distinctive Dutch corners of New York as potentially casualties of progress. So I think that theme comes through even more clearly in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So let's turn to that one. Again, this is a story that most of us are familiar with, and much like Heiliger, it's a ghost story. So what's interesting about Irving is that he uses a lot of these really standard ghost story conventions that I think most of us are pretty familiar with. But he then often pulls the curtain back to kind of reveal to us that everything is fake, that, the ghosts aren't real, the legends and superstitions aren't real. They might be kind of fun, but certainly in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, he reveals the true nature of everything that we've been scared of, everything that we've been seeing and hearing. So he does kind of disabuse us of our notions, of our beliefs, but at the same time, he seems to celebrate this sort of distinctive old Dutch culture that can still be found in parts of New York, at least at the point at which he's writing, or, a few decades prior. So again, we have real places here. He's once again historicizing the U.S. We hear about Tarrytown and the Tappan Zee, which is just a particular bend in the Hudson River that I think now forms the border between like two counties in New York, just a little bit north of the city. So these are all real places that you can look up on a map, much like Norwalk. Much like some of the places Brown was dealing with in Edgar Huntley. Now, because they're so close to a major city, a lot of these places might not really register as wild or rural or idyllic, but in these previous eras, they were. So Irving is very much trying to create this kind of pastoral, idyllic setting in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, where it's almost like time stands still. Like, we really haven't seen a lot of change or progress in this one little place. So he uses that metaphor of the little nooks of still water to describe this particular place, this little Dutch settlement that's remained kind of untouched thus far by progress and change. Meanwhile, the currents of change, are all around it, but it remains as it was, at least for now. But we get that sense that progress is out there. Change and modernization, it's out there, it's happening. And it seems perhaps inevitable that it will eventually visit this region as well. So, he's tapping into an old Dutch history. He's also tapping into certain lore and legends surrounding the American Revolution. So you guys might want to be familiar with a few terms and a few names that you come across in the text. So he mentions, the ghost of the Hessian trooper. You might want to look up what a Hessian was. My understanding is that they were like German mercenaries who fought on the side of the British during the Revolution. So that's kind of important to remember. He mentions this guy, John Andre, who I think was like a spy. I'm forgetting his bio now. I think he was a spy who might have been executed somewhere in that area. So again, it helps to know a little bit about the history that Irving is drawing on, because he would, of course, expected his readers to be pretty familiar. In the 1820s, 1830s, most readers would have known these names, these figures, these events from the Revolution. And there was apparently a battle during the Revolution fought very close to here. So, for the most part, these Dutch colonists would have been, as far as I know, probably on the side of independence. I don't think they were loyal in any way to the Brits. So there's a history here that's very much tied to our independence, our victory in the war, but also this old Dutch presence that hasn't been completely taken over by a sort of English inheritance, not yet. So again, idyllic, pastoral, it's an old way of life, and Irving's interested in this tension between this way of life and the rapidly modernizing U.S. But what I want you guys to understand is that Ichabod Crane, in addition to being a comic figure, somebody that I think we're invited to laugh at, he also kind of represents the larger country at this point in history, because Ichabod is a great feeder. He is a consumer. And that's very much, I think, how Irving wants us to understand the larger nation. Think about Crane for a moment. He's very acquisitive. He wants to acquire land and wealth. That seems like at least part of the reason, a large part of the reason that he's courting Katrina, because of her family's wealth. We hear him kind of dreaming about going out into some of these wild districts of the U.S. that hadn't really been settled yet and acquiring a bunch of land, because frankly, that's what was happening at this time as new places like Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio were opening up after the Revolution. Which again, what does that mean? Let's not use a euphemism. What does that really mean? Native Americans were being killed or pushed off, and then that made it safe for settlers to move in. That was happening with frequency, throughout the end of the 18th century, throughout the early stages of the 19th. So it wasn't terribly difficult for somebody with some means, with a little bit of money, to go out there and buy land for relatively cheap, build a new place, set up shop, try to build a farm, and make a new life for yourself. That seems like what Ichabod wants to do. Also, keep in mind that Ichabod is not Dutch, right? I think he's like from Connecticut or something. So a little bit like Irving, he has a more English kind of heritage, but he's just living amongst this old Dutch community, but he's not really one of them. And I think that's made clear throughout the text. He's a little bit of an outsider. He's a schoolmaster. He's come there to teach school. But he obviously has larger ambitions. And it's important to keep that in mind. He's a bit selfish, but he's very enterprising, right? He's sort of quintessentially American. And Irving is making that point when he stresses how much Crane likes to eat, right? He's a consumer. He always wants more. And I think that has a lot of importance for us. That's very symbolic, that stuff about the food, because that really represents his views on everything. And then later, we learn that he has gone on to do all of these different things. After he leaves this little Dutch valley, once he leaves the still waters of this old culture, this old society, he goes on and he kind of participates in the rapid modernization of America. I can't remember all the different things that we see him do. I thought I wrote some of these down, but he, I think, gets involved in the legal profession. I think he becomes like a journalist of some kind. Like he writes, he becomes like a small-time like magistrate or judge. So Irving's just telling us at the end that, Crane leaves this way of life and he joins the main currents of American progress. And that's important to remember. Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought I don't have the text right in front of me today, but I thought I had a bunch of his future occupations written down. But it doesn't seem like I do. But you guys can look at those towards the end of the text. Yeah, sorry. I thought I had those. I had a list of all the things that he did, but yeah, I mean, all of the different occupations that he fills sort of represent a modernizing, changing America. So that's what's sort of important to keep in mind. And we also get the sense that this area is also changing, that at the time that Irving is writing, things have changed. Progress has been achieved, and that might come at a great cost to a certain extent. Okay, so I thought I had more on Irving, but I guess I don't. So let's just move on and talk a little bit about Hawthorne, who's writing roughly 1 decade after the text that we're seeing here from Irving. So Hawthorne's kind of an inheritor of this tradition. But he's a New Englander. He descends from Puritans. He has very different sort of aims and preoccupations. He's a more committed, devoted writer of fiction. And I would say Hawthorne really is a master of the short story form. That's something that we'll talk a little bit more about. Well, we're going to see a lot of masters of the short story. We're going to see Poe next week. We're going to read a little bit from Melville and some of his short fiction as well. So we're going to notice that short stories are becoming, in some ways, kind of a uniquely American literary genre around the middle of the 19th century. It's not that we're the only ones who are writing them. But we are writing them perhaps with a little bit more precision and a little bit more consistency than other national literary traditions. And many of our short story writers become some of our early famous writers, some of our early noteworthy literary figures. So Irving kind of begins that. He kind of gets that ball rolling. And then Hawthorne comes along and begins to publish short fiction in the 1830s. Hawthorne's active for quite a while. He's writing throughout the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. We're going to sort of move on from him soon, but just keep in mind that he's writing for several decades. And he's another important figure. He wasn't massively popular during his day. He wasn't massively popular during his own lifetime, although he was read, he was known, he was, his works were reviewed in the periodicals of the day, but much like Melville, he sort of became more significant to us, to readers and critics and scholars after his death. He was sort of rehabilitated, rediscovered to a certain extent, and we now hold him up as one of the most important American writers of the 19th century. He's also considered a part of a larger literary movement that we're going to be talking about soon called the American Renaissance. And I'm actually going to wait until week 10 before we really dive into it completely, because next week we're going to be preoccupied with Poe. It's Halloween. We're going to spend the whole time on Poe. But then in week 10, I want to take a step back from our actual texts, and I want to do a little bit more history, and I want to talk about the American Renaissance as it was conceived in the middle of the 20th century. So about 100 years after these guys were writing, American literary scholars come together in the 1940s, early 1950s, and they basically decide, okay, here are the heavy hitters of 19th century American lit, and really all of them early American lit, because they didn't think really anything that came out in the 1700s was particularly worthwhile. So they kind of created the heavyweight category that we still kind of use today in our study of American lit, although, as I've said, we've broadened this category and we've certainly included more authors. But we still think about Hawthorne, Melville, Emerson, Whitman. We're going to read all of those guys. We think of those figures, and then Poe is often thrown in as well. We think of those figures as being sort of the first really important American writers, and Irving would sort of get a brief nod or mention as the grandfather. Maybe even Brown would get a footnote. Those guys would be mentioned as sort of the forerunners, and then we get to the really good group of the American Renaissance. So we'll talk more about that in week 10, because by that point we will have already read Hawthorne and Poe, and we'll be getting ready to move into Melville, Emerson, and finally Whitman. So we have a whole unit called the American Renaissance, so we're getting started on it right now, really. But I want us to kind of focus on our first few authors, and then we'll zoom out and do the historical lesson a little bit later. But Hawthorne is a part of this, and Hawthorne in some ways is kind of the first one of that group to really publish. He and Poe are both active in the 1830s. I guess Emerson too. Although again, Emerson's not really a fiction writer, but he's important too. The Transcendentalists, we have to at least briefly mention them, primarily for us, just him and Thoreau. But we'll get to them as well, and then we'll move up into the other figures like Melville, who's one of my favorites, and Whitman. But starting with Hawthorne, we're going to see a lot of the things that we will continue to talk about for the next few weeks. Sort of a greater command of craft. Again, some of the reasons why these guys were perceived as being the best. Maybe a greater command of craft, an interest in American culture and history. That's not new, but because of certain progress or certain developments that have already occurred, perhaps their perspective yields more results. Also, a level of complexity, narrative complexity that critics and scholars often like. They might even mistake it for quality sometimes, but we can talk more about that. Some wit, some playfulness, but also a command of many different genres and registers. We're going to talk about this a lot with Poe. People just think of Poe as being a spooky guy who wrote sort of gothic horror stories, and he certainly did, but he also wrote a lot of other kinds of stuff. He worked in a lot of other kinds of genres. And that's true of Hawthorne as well. I think we kind of have a perception of Hawthorne, and it's not totally unfounded, as being kind of dull, being sort of old-fashioned, and he kind of is by our standards. I think this is a little bit of a tangent, but my first experience with Hawthorne came in high school, I think my junior year, when I was assigned the Scarlet Letter. And it's a bit embarrassing for me to admit this now, but I did not read it as a junior in high school. My friends and I decided that we just were not going to do that. And we weren't terrible students. I mean, I hadn't really discovered my vocation yet. That would be college. But we weren't bad students. We typically liked our English classes, but reading that book at age 16, it just wasn't happening for us. We had no interest. We did not read it, and we very much enjoyed not reading it and sort of getting away with it. So I'm not proud of it by any means, but I think that's a common experience that many high schoolers have. Our first experience with Hawthorne will often be his novels. And at least in my day, those novels, or at least, The Scarlet Letter, was forced upon high schoolers. And I don't think high schoolers are really equipped intellectually to read that book or to really appreciate Hawthorne in a lot of ways. Now, of course, I was probably just lazy. There are plenty of exceptions to my rule, but I think part of our problem with Hawthorne is we don't always read the best stuff. I mean, The Scarlet Letter is a good novel, and he wrote other good novels. The House of the Seven Gables, The Marble Faun. But as modern readers, as contemporary students, it's always been my contention that we should really approach the short stories first, because he's a master, like I said, of that short story form that was really getting kind of codified and standardized here in the middle decades of the 19th century. Remember, short stories really haven't been around very long. They're even more recent. They're even newer in the grand scheme of things than novels. So the short stories are more fun, and I think if we look at My Kinsman, we're going to see that it's actually funny. Hawthorne can be funny. He's not always dour and boring, although sometimes he is. Sometimes he is. So Hawthorne's interesting just to think a little bit about his heritage. So he's from Salem, Massachusetts. He has very much Puritan heritage. In fact, some of his, ancestors, like his great-great-grandfather or something like that, was one of the judges who was presiding over the Salem witch trials. So Hawthorne kind of repudiated his own family's history because he knew that he had, ancestors who were, pretty important, members of that local community. So he kind of repudiates his Puritan past, the intolerance of that era, the outright bigotry, frankly, that they were often guilty of. He repudiates that, and by the time he comes along in the early 19th century, New England's changed quite a bit. It's not really a Puritan society anymore, not in the way that it was 200 years earlier during Bradstreet's day. Certain aspects of the Puritan character probably remained. I mean, just judging from what I've read, I'm not a New Englander myself, but certainly there were aspects of their Puritan past that, did remain. But by the time Hawthorne comes along, most people were Congregationalist or Unitarians. They weren't quite as strict. They had become a little bit more progressive and forward-thinking, at least in terms of religion. Still a bit socially conservative in many corners, and Hawthorne himself kind of was. But not the same, right? Not what we saw back in the 1600s or even the early 1700s. So the society has changed a lot, but Hawthorne's interested in their Puritan past. He often writes about it. He often uses it for the raw materials needed for fiction. But really, he's just interested in our colonial past in general. As we'll see with My Kinsman, Major Molyneux, he's just interested in sort of the decades leading up to the Revolution, political unrest, and the development of kind of a unique society and culture, which was very much ongoing throughout the time period that we see depicted here in the text. So this story really is one of my favorites. It's just wonderfully told. It's subtle. It's funny. It's a deeply rich text that I think, at least in some cases, it requires multiple readings. When I first read this story as a college student, I really didn't get it at first. I'm being very confessional with you guys today. I don't usually do that. But yeah, the first time I read this, I mean, I had a general sense of what was going on, but I missed a lot of the humor, and I missed a lot of the specifics in individual scenes. Because Hawthorne isn't always being 100% clear here. There is a lot of ambiguity. It's not a coincidence that this entire text takes place at night. And we do have a bright moon helping to illuminate our way, but we often find ourselves, much like young Robin, our protagonist, we often find ourselves lost. Both literally and figuratively. We're lost in the dark. Robin is literally lost in this city. So the truth is not always immediately evident to either Robin or to us, the readers. So don't feel bad if you need to go back and read it a second time. It's not a very long story. It's only about, 15 pages in that PDF that I posted. But this is also, it's a great gateway to Hawthorne. Like I said, it has a lot of fun stuff. It's very sly. It's very ironic. It's funny once you're kind of listening for the humor and watching for it. But it's also just a great gateway to Hawthorne's sort of larger corpus, because we see a lot of his preoccupations here. Like I mentioned before, we see a lot of the themes and motifs that he would often pursue in a lot of his fiction. He's often very fixated on dreamlike situations, the otherworldly, feeling like you're in a dream, that thin line that sometimes separates dreams from reality. He's also very interested in the friction between rural America and urban America. Much like Irving. He's very interested in that contrast. So Robin is a country guy. He's from the country. He comes from a rural area. And he arrives in this small metropolis and he experiences a whole different world, a whole different way of life. So Hawthorne's interested in that. He's also interested in the loss of faith. Again, this kind of mirrors his own life. I think he remained fairly religious, but he he repudiated the faith of his ancestors. He repudiated kind of his own family's history. You should keep that in mind because that's not dissimilar to what we see with Robin by the end of this story. So a lot of times Hawthorne's characters, they experience a crisis of faith or they lose their faith. They become disillusioned in various ways. And we see that. We definitely see that on display in this text. So I want to talk a little bit about our setting here, because it's very important. On the first page, our narrator tells us that this story is taking place roughly 100 years prior to the publication of the story. So we see that this story was originally published in 1832, so that means we are back in the 1730s, roughly. And we're probably in Boston. I don't know that for certain, but this place is described as a little metropolis of a New England colony. There were other urban environments in New England, but Boston would have been the biggest by far at this point in history. So we're in 1730s Boston. So several decades prior to the American Revolution. Again, it's important to remember that at this point, in our historical setting here, we are still colonies. We are not independent yet. So keep that in mind. And Robin is not from the city. Robin, like I said, he's from an outlying country district. So this is kind of a classic bumpkin comes to town sort of narrative. And you guys have probably seen stories like these. Some of them are kind of framed like Bildungsroman, like that sort of idea of a coming of age story. But we still see these kinds of narratives a lot, where somebody from a small town or some kind of rural place, they travel to the big city to make their way in the world. And they often experience a lot of change, a lot of turmoil, whatever. And that's all happening here. So Robin is sort of a well-intentioned young man. He's 18 years old. He's like physically strong. He's like sort of big and imposing physically, but he's very naive. He obviously has not seen much of the world. He has not traveled. And the narrator tells us that this is his first visit to the city. And we're going to see that he really misunderstands a lot of things about city life. And that's where a lot of the humor comes from Robin's failure to understand what's going on around him. But like I said, as readers, if we're not paying close attention, we often fail to understand what's going on around Robin. So sometimes our experiences as readers kind of echo Robin's experiences as the character. But slowly, Robin learns things. He becomes a little bit wiser as the narrative progresses, and hopefully that's true for us as well. But Robin's from, not that far away, probably just some rural part of Massachusetts. Again, much like these other places that we've been talking about in Pennsylvania or New York, if you went to Robin's hometown now, it's probably just a suburb of Boston. But back in the 1730s, it was the wilderness. It's like Norwalk. It's like the old Dutch villages that haven't really been touched by progress. It's out there. It's different. It's almost separate from the city. It's the same colony, right? The same kinds of people live there, but their ways of life are drastically different. And the narrator goes to great lengths to make this point to us. If you look in the PDF on page 7, I have better notes here for Hawthorne. I guess that shows my preference. At one point on page 7, the narrator mentions a wizard of Robin's own country. Again, making it seem like Robin lives far, far away, and also exoticizing Robin's home, referring to a wizard, right? Kind of using these supernatural elements. And he's saying that this wizard back in Robin's home cast a spell on these 3 people and caused them to wander out in the cold, even though they were very close to the place they were searching for. So this is just a way to other Robin, to make it seem like he's very foreign, he's very alien in this urban space, because he comes from this kind of old mystical land out in the woods where they still have wizards and spells, and that's Robin's background. So that's just the contrast that we're supposed to understand when he arrives in Boston. But again, the narrator's kind of putting it on a little bit thick, because there's a lot of irony really in this story. The narrator at times might be making fun of Robin a little bit. We'll talk more about that at the end. But we are meant to understand that this is a very new and different environment for Robin. And again, he fails to understand. That's a key motif here, is misunderstanding. He has these series of misadventures. So I just wanted to walk through a few of these today, just the ones that I kind of picked out and thought were funny. Number 1, when he goes into the tavern. Well, actually, I want to start with the barber, because this is an important sort of first episode. Again, he's trying to find his kinsman, Major Molyneux, who's probably like his uncle. And this was a pretty common practice at this point in history. So remember, Robin is a bumpkin, sort of. And that's kind of a derogatory term, but he's, a rural country kid coming to the city to kind of seek his fortune. And this would have been common in the early modern world, maybe even going back to the Middle Ages. For a sort of middle-class person who isn't exactly elite or super affluent, but isn't, at the bottom rung of the social hierarchy, but somewhere in that middle ground, like Eliza, it would be common if you weren't the eldest son of a family, and we learned that Robin is not. If you're not the eldest son of your family, and you're not in line to inherit whatever your father has to offer, maybe some land, maybe at least the house you grow up in, maybe even a vocation if you want to go into the clergy, follow in your dad's footsteps or whatever. If you're not destined for that, you kind of have to make your own way. So we talked about this in relation to Eliza. As a middle-class woman, yeah, she grew up in relative comfort, but she's not going to inherit any money or property from her dad, from her family. As a woman, she's not in line for any of that. So she has to go and find a husband to provide a middle-class life for her. For a young man, for like the second or third son of a family, they might have to go to the city. They might have to leave their home and go out and seek a fortune, seek a job, a career, a life elsewhere. But oftentimes, if you had a relative who already lived in the city, a relative who already left the farm, already left that rural community where your family is from, and they've already kind of made their way in the world, then now the young man seeking his fortune can go and get a little bit of help from the mature, established, successful relative. So again, this is almost like an old world custom. This would have been common in Europe, like I said, throughout the early modern period, and that's what we're seeing here. Robin is going to the city to try to make a life for himself, but he's going to get a jump start through his connection to his uncle or his relative, Major Molyneux. So he thinks that Major Molyneux is a big deal. He thinks that Major Molyneux has a really good reputation. He's widely respected. And just by being connected to this guy, Robin thinks that he's going to be able to get ahead. And that might be what we think too initially, but we soon learn that he's wrong. Robin's wrong about a lot of things. So the first episode I was going to look at is at the barber shop, where he comes in and sort of just immediately approaches somebody, grabs this guy's coat, and asks him if he knows where Major Molyneux lives. So this is on page 2 of the PDF. And he does not necessarily get a friendly response. So this is page, is this page 2? Yeah, I think so. No, it's actually... the pagination's confusing me here. I'm sorry. Is this page 3? This is the bottom of page 2. So this is the bottom of page 2, top of page 3. Let go my garment, fellow. He gets a very rude reception, but I want you to see what happens at the top of page 3. Look at how Robin understands this exchange. As he leaves the barbershop, he's sort of talking to himself. And he says, referring to the rude guy, "This is some country representative," was his conclusion, "who has never seen the inside of my kinsman's door and lacks the breeding to answer a stranger civilly. The man is old, or verily, I might be tempted to turn back and smite him on the nose." And now again, he's like talking to himself. This is almost like an interior monologue. "Oh, Robin, Robin, even the barber's boys laugh at you for choosing such a guide. You will be wiser in time, friend Robin." That's a very important moment in the text. You will be wiser in time, Robin. In some ways, that's true, but not necessarily in the way he thinks. So again, Robin doesn't really know how things work in the city. Back in his small town, neighbors are probably very friendly to one another. Everybody knows one another. And he's assuming that everybody in Boston knows his kinsman, knows his uncle. But he learns... Well, eventually he learns the truth, but here he's misunderstanding. He thinks that this guy, who might be a bit on the rude side, he thinks that this guy is just some ignoramus who isn't worthy of knowing his kinsman. And he says, "Oh, this guy must be old and just kind of doddering. Otherwise, I would go back and smite him on the nose." So he's misunderstanding. But also think about his own conduct. You know, he walks into this place and he approaches a stranger, and he is sort of courteous in his address, but he also grabs the skirt of the man's coat. So maybe a little too personal, maybe a little too direct, because this is not small town life. This is not rural America. This is different. Not everybody knows each other, and not everybody's going to respond favorably to his overtures. So that's kind of the first episode that we can look at. And then he moves on to the inn to again, sort of find information and also maybe, I don't know, get a meal or a drink. So back in these days, typically an inn would have had like a tavern or a bar, you know, on the first floor where you could order food and ale or rum. I think a lot of the men are drinking rum from the Caribbean when Robin comes in. Kind of another reminder that we have this larger colonial network already in place with a lot of imports coming in. But, you know, he goes in, and then up above the bar or tavern, you would have had rooms lodgings for travelers. So Robin goes in, and immediately the proprietor, the innkeeper, notices that Robin is clearly from the country. He's clearly, not a local. So he attempts to wait on Robin, but also probably take advantage of Robin, assuming that Robin is ignorant, naive, and easily deceived, and he's not necessarily wrong. But this is a very funny scene, and if you're not paying close attention to what's going on here, you might sort of miss the humor a little bit. I actually want to scroll down and see if I can read this. So down near the bottom of page 4, eventually Robin reveals that he does not have any money, so he can't pay for a meal or a room or anything. So at this point, the proprietor is just not interested in helping him at all. Again, Robin misunderstands the reason why. Later on, he's surprised that the name of his kinsman does not outweigh his lack of money. So again, he thinks that that things are very different from the way they really are in this place. He thinks that his uncle, his kinsman's name will carry such weight that he can get a free meal, or he can get information, or maybe even more just by mentioning the name. Again, maybe that would have worked in small town, rural Massachusetts, but not here. But this is a funny moment, because after Robin reveals that he's broke, notice what the innkeeper does. The innkeeper this is at the bottom of page 4, the last 2 paragraphs on the page. The innkeeper turned his eyes to a written paper on the wall, which he read, or seemed to read, with occasional recurrences to the young man's figure. So this paper on the wall, probably pinned up along with a lot of other public notices, this paper is like a wanted notice. There's about a fugitive that's on the run. So the innkeeper starts to read all the description about the fugitive while occasionally looking back at Robin, as if he's starting to think that Robin is the fugitive. He says, "What have we here? Left the house of the subscriber, bounden servant." He reads on, describes what he's wearing, and he's looking back at Robin as if to say, "I think you might be the guy that's on the run." So he concludes by saying, "Better trudge, boy, better trudge." So again, Robin is sort of being laughed at. He's being sort of mocked here, but notice his reaction. It's important to notice that there are several points in the story where Robin considers resorting to violence. Remember that he's carrying around an oak cudgel, right? So it's like this sort of stick, or like this, heavy instrument that he would presumably be able to use to beat people with. To cudgel somebody is to just sort of beat them with this blunt object. So he's carrying around this oak cudgel, clearly, for self-defense. But there are several moments, he doesn't bring much with him, right? He doesn't have any money. He's already eaten all of his food, so mostly he just has the clothes on his back. But he does have this oak cudgel, and at various points he considers using it. Like right here, he considers using it to beat the innkeeper over the head. But he thinks better of it once he sees that everybody else in the tavern, they're all sort of looking at him with hostility. So he realizes that he just needs to move on. But there are other times. He's so hungry at one point, he considers maybe just stopping any passerby and demanding food by sort of, brandishing his cudgel. So he thinks about using it several times. He never actually does. But he does considerate. So he's no stranger to violence. I mean, clearly, life back on the farm or back in the woods, it's not all innocence and good nature. He's clearly not a stranger to using physical force to sometimes get what he wants or to settle disputes. Remember his response to the guy in the barbershop. If he wasn't so old, I'd go back there and hit him on the nose. So Robin often thinks about violence. He never quite resorts to it, but we can tell that it's not unfamiliar to him. Violence is not strange to him. So while he is naive in the ways of the city, he's not quite an innocent in all respects. It's kind of important to keep that in mind. And we also sort of see a reminder of that when he moves on. His next misadventure occurs at a brothel, where he encounters what we can assume, I think, pretty safely, is a prostitute. So he asks if she knows where Major Molyneux lives, and her response, again, is kind of funny. She says, "Oh, he lives here. He's here. He's at least lodging there. So, oh, you found him. Great. Now you can come in as well. And he's asleep right now. He had a lot to drink, but maybe you can see him a little bit later." So at first, Robin thinks, oh, great, finally, my luck has turned. But even he begins to realize that maybe she's not quite telling him the truth. And before he gets chased off by the watchman, she's sort of like dragging him into the brothel. But at this point, he's only half willing. He's kind of half resisting because he begins to realize that he begins to kind of understand what's going on and what this establishment really is. But again, I want you to notice this very subtle thing. Before it completely dawns on him, when he's first talking to the young lady, and she says, "Oh yeah, Major Molyneux's here." The narrator tells us that Robin says, I believe cunningly, that, oh, how lucky he is to have a pretty housekeeper like you. So he's attracted to her, and he's kind of interested in her, and he's even perhaps prepared to flirt with her a little bit, especially if she really is, part of his kinsman's household. But then he realizes that he's once again gone astray, and he wants to get out of there. But again, the watchman is sort of yelling at him, so that also compels him to leave. But again, don't view Robin necessarily as a complete innocent, but he's certainly a stranger to city life. So he continues to wander. He has, a bunch of other experiences, but eventually he comes across a representative. Actually, I think this happens soon after he leaves the brothel. He comes across a representative of a secret society that is loosely based on the real-life Sons of Liberty in Boston. So a lot of what we see in the later stages of the text might seem rather strange if you don't have a little historical context. So remember, these are the decades leading up to the Revolution. There's a lot of anti-British sentiment in the colonies, particularly in New England, where you tended to have the denser, the most dense populations and the most political organizing. So around page 8, he comes across a representative of one of these secret societies, and he actually saw this guy previously in the inn. And they almost have a violent confrontation with this Robin almost has a confrontation with who he will later describe as an ill-favored fellow. This guy has his face painted, and he seems to be dressed up perhaps as a Native American or in some other guise. So this was common during the time. These secret societies who were sort of conspiring against the crown and against the representatives of the crown in the colonies. These secret societies would often paint their faces. Sometimes they would dress like Native Americans. They would use like passwords and like sort of codes that wouldn't be intelligible to other people outside of the societies. So Robin kind of runs into these guys. First, just one guy who tells them, "Oh, if you want to see your kinsman, wait here for an hour and he'll pass by." So that's kind of our first hint that perhaps something bad has happened to Robin's kinsman. Perhaps unlike Robin's expectation, perhaps his kinsman is not held in high regard. Maybe something is going on here that we didn't previously understand and that Robin clearly does not understand, because there's some kind of tumult that he eventually comes across. After a few more wanderings, he sits outside of a church for a while. The tension builds, the mystery builds, and Robin sort of grows increasingly desperate and angry. And there is this dream-like quality to the narrative as he continues to wander. Remember, it's dark. He's often guided by the moonlight, but there's this sort of recurring motif of light that runs through the entire text. All the references to the moon, to moonbeams, but then later when he comes across this procession or this large gathering of people, we also see the light from torches and, lanterns that people are carrying. Of course, this is pre-electricity. So we have all of these different sources of light, and those have a lot of symbolic or figurative significance. But Robin finally meets a friendly person. I believe this is around page 10, right before the sort of procession comes along. And again, this is being sort of put on by this secret society that, again, is very much based on a real-life society in Boston called the Sons of Liberty, who would often do, they were basically sort of saboteurs, conspirators. They were trying to undermine British authority in various ways, and they were trying to organize resistance to British rule in the colonies. So this is kind of the early stages of the rebellion that would eventually erupt in the form of the American Revolution, as we know. So a lot of this stuff was going on really like in the 1750s, the 1760s. In 1765, you had the Stamp Act. You guys might want to Wikipedia that or Google that. The Sons of Liberty, I think, were kind of active in the resistance during that period. So we're a little bit earlier now. We're in the 1730s, a little bit before some of those real historical events. But Hawthorne's tapping in to that same kind of history here, the same era of sort of burgeoning anti-British sentiment, political organizing. But we also learned on page 1 that representatives of the British Crown, so like the governors, the local rulers that were sent over by the Crown to govern in the colonies, they were often treated rather rudely in this particular colony. We learned that very early on. The narrator wants us to understand that. So oftentimes representatives of the British Crown would be, well, we're about to see. But Robin doesn't really know that. And as readers at the beginning, we might not fully understand that, but it becomes clear. It becomes illuminated by the end. So this friendly guy that he meets around page 10 finally sort of seems to take a little bit of pity on him, but he also seems to be a little bit amused by Robin because, again, like everybody else, he can tell that Robin's kind of a country bumpkin who doesn't really know what's going on. So the conversation between those two is really quite delightful. It takes place between page 10 and page 12. And then finally, soon after, on page 13, the truth about Robin's kinsman is finally revealed. So just notice this particular passage and notice that initially, when right before we finally see Molyneux, it's all the light that initially prevents Robin from seeing what's really there. Initially, the light obscures what's really there. The glare from all of those torches and lanterns. So initially, Robin can't tell. But then, On page 13, he does. He does see. And he does finally come to understand. There, the torches blazed the brightest, and the moon shone out like day. And there, in tar and feather dignity, sat his kinsman, Major Molyneux. So now we understand. Major Molyneux has been tarred and feathered, literally. And this was a practice that was kind of common in colonial America. Oftentimes, representatives of the British Crown or people who were just loyal to the British, sometimes regular citizens would get tarred and feathered if they were not viewed as sufficiently sympathetic to the colonists' cause. So that's what's happened to Major Molyneux here. Now, I'm not sure if Major Molyneux is a really high-ranking official or if he's maybe a more minor figure. Hawthorne doesn't really explain it. But clearly, Molyneux has been lumped in with the Brits. Molyneux either represents the British or he is favorable to the British, and that has caused him to fall out of favor with many of the other local residents of Boston. So the secret society, the Sons of Liberty types, have gotten a hold of him, tarred and feathered him, and now they are parading him through the streets, and everybody is laughing. Everybody is laughing at him, including, eventually, Robin. So that's kind of the turning point. Robin joins in the general merriment. He joins in and he laughs at his kinsman. And he does not come to his kinsman's aid. He does not attempt to help or intercede in any way. So this is obviously a turning point for Robin. And a lot of critics think that at this point, he kind of becomes a more modern person and he becomes more of a true American, perhaps, in various ways. Why is that? Well, like I said before, this whole custom that he's been trying to partake in, finding his way in the world with the aid of his kinsman, that's kind of old-fashioned. Perhaps his kinsman is also old-fashioned if he's sort of tied to the British. And obviously he's not supported by the locals. So by rejecting his kinsman, much like Hawthorne rejected many aspects of his own heritage, Robin is making a break from the past. And he's saying, all right, I'm looking ahead. I'm looking to the future. And the future in America, during Hawthorne's time, certainly, was all about the meritocracy. It was all about, hey, anybody can make it in America as long as you work hard, you do the right things, and, you have the will. It doesn't matter what your family connections are. It doesn't matter where you come from. And that's really driven home in that final exchange between Robin and his new friend. But notice another motif that runs through the entire text. We often hear Robin referred to as a shrewd youth. There are many references to his shrewdness. So in this case, that's supposed to mean that he's smart or very discerning. At least that's the outward meaning. But this is another example of Hawthorne's irony, because oftentimes, for most of the story, really, Robin is not particularly shrewd. He's not particularly discerning. He doesn't really understand what's going on. So when he's referred to as a shrewd youth, I think he even refers to himself as a shrewd youth near the end. Oftentimes that's meant sort of comically, that's meant to be funny, because he's not really shrewd. But maybe by the end, he really has learned something. I mean, he clearly has learned something about his kinsman, but maybe he's learned a little bit more about America. He's learned a little bit more, certainly, about Boston, this small metropolis of a New England colony. He's learning, he's growing, perhaps he is maturing. in various ways. And again, look at that final exchange between Robin and his new friend. After seeing his kinsman and laughing, Robin's like, all right, I think it's time I go home. Can you show me the way to the ferry? He wants to get back to the boat that brought him over in the first place. And his new friend says, no, not yet. If you still want to leave, later, like tomorrow or whatever, sure, I'll take you. But I think you should wait and see. He says, where's the quote? Or if you prefer to remain with us, perhaps, as you are a shrewd youth, you may rise in the world without the help of your kinsman, Major Molyneux. Notice that conclusion, without the help of your kinsman. So again, this is the idea that, hey, this is modern America. We don't need those old world customs. We don't need to rely on an affluent relative who's already left the farm and moved to the city. That's old world. That's Europe. This is the modern world, and this is America. So in this place, at this time, you don't need to worry about your humiliated kinsman. Forget about him. He has no standing in this place. But notice that that doesn't ruin Robin's chances. Robin can disassociate himself from his own family and make his own way in the world. At least that's suggested. That is an idea that we see at the end. And again, is the guy kind of making fun of Robin a little bit by, again, referring to him as a shrewd youth? Maybe. Or maybe he thinks that Robin really can rise in the world. He's physically capable, he's relatively educated. For middle-class people like Robin, college really isn't in the cards, right? He's leaving home at 18 in the way that a modern person would, perhaps to go off to college. For him, he's going off to make his way. But he's somewhat educated. He's literate. Again, he's physically capable, and he can learn. He can adapt. And that's what we're left with at the end of the story. He can probably adapt to city life. He can learn these new customs, and he can make his own way, the American way. And whether we buy that or not, we all know that's such a huge central part of our mythology, and Hawthorne's definitely tapping into it here. Again, the contrast between old and new. We see it in Irving, we see it in Hawthorne, we see progress. Hawthorne might be a little bit more on the side of progress, whereas Irving seems to be lamenting it in various ways, but they're both very aware of the rapid change that's occurring. So that's why their fiction is worth studying. If we want to have a better understanding of the early 19th century in the U.S. and all of the changes that go along with that period, these works of fiction can help us do that. All right, so let me stop there because I've gone on and on. So I'm sorry for the length. Hopefully you enjoy both of our authors this week. Next week, in honor of Halloween, we're spending all of our time on Poe. So hopefully we'll enjoy that, and I will see you then.